Alrighty, today we begin our final STAR review session. We will be going back over the civil rights movement, the end of the Cold War, the modern era, and then looking at some just overall summative review materials. So let's dive into the civil rights movement, and you can kind of see I've added a couple annotations already. The first one is just to stress that for the STAR test, you will need to be able to tell the difference between the nonviolent and violent part of the movement, to be able to differentiate between their goals and the people associated with them. The other thing that should come to mind are our Reconstruction era amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, free citizens' votes, the abolition of slavery, the citizenship to all former slaves, and then the granting of the right to vote to all African American men. All right, we're going to be looking at the organizations and the key players in those. The first organization is the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. One of the events that they are most responsible for, it's not letting me highlight it, oh well, is the Montgomery bus boycott. So I'll just make a box for that. So make sure you know the Montgomery bus boycott. Good night. There we go. The Montgomery bus boycott goes with SCLC. This is also Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and those are the two leaders that you need to know. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. An additional organization is the SNCC, sometimes referred to as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were trying to give more of a voice to younger Black men during this time period. These are the freedom rides that we studied. These are the sit-ins at the lunch counters, and they are going to slowly turn towards some more violent forms of protest and then disband shortly thereafter. And remember, the civil rights movement, as it grows, kind of has a ripple effect and influences other organizations to also fight for equality. And one of those is going to be the feminist movement. And one thing to know about feminism is it doesn't mean it's not radical. It just means at its heart, equality for men and women. So the organization you need to know is NOW, the National Organization for Women, and the leader that you need to know is Betty Friedan. She is the author of a book called The Feminine Mystique. There we go. In that book, it really kind of focuses on the overall idea in society at that time that women should just be satisfied, staying at home, taking care of a family. But in Betty Friedan's book, she says that it's okay for women to feel like there must be more out there beyond this, beyond just being a mom and a wife. And that was a really radical idea at the time period that her book was written. NOW is still a very active organization in our country. Their website is right there, and you can go on and see any of the cases that they're involved in or any issues that they're currently working on. The Chicano movement is another important movement that we studied, inspiring Hispanic Americans to work towards equality. The three leaders that you need to know are Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Dr. Hector Garcia. One of the other things to remember about the Chicano movement, besides working for farm laborers, was the Chicano mural movement. The beautiful murals that were painted highlighting the Hispanic culture across the United States. All right, two of the important court cases listed on the Chicano movement are Brown v. Board of Education and Hernandez v. Texas. Now, Brown v. Board really applies to all of the civil rights movement. It's listed here, trying to show that it didn't just apply for separate but equal, being applied just to African Americans, but also beyond that for all minority groups. So we're going to highlight those two court cases here a little bit later in the lesson as far as what they did, but just be aware of them applying to the Chicano movement as well. CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality, and you need to add James Farmer as the leader there. CORE also began as a nonviolent organization. Again, the Freedom Rides, Freedom Summer, they were all part of that organization. Eventually, though, they are going to shift towards more of a focus on Black nationalism and separatism. They still wanted equality, but they also began to think that would come with two separate societies. The March on Washington and the lunch sit-ins at the lunch counters were also part of the movement that CORE helped with. And several of their leaders were murdered by KKK members in 1964. All right, that is the nonviolent side of the movement. The next slide is the violent side. And we want to be sure to emphasize, by calling it the violent side or the violent organizations, it does not mean that they wanted to use violence all the time. However, they felt that violence was an appropriate reaction and that it could be used when necessary to achieve their goals. One of the groups that was inspired by the civil rights movement was the American Indian Movement, or AIM. They fought for housing and issues over poverty and police harassment against Native Americans. One of the, I added a little box here, maybe some terms that you might want to associate this would be the Dawes Act, assimilation. The example would be the Alcatraz protest, where they lived on Alcatraz Island for almost a full year to bring attention to that. AIM is still around and still active today. One of the causes that most of you would be aware of would be the renaming of sports teams to reflect sensitivity towards the Native American culture. So most recently, like the Washington Redskins football team was renamed the Cleveland Indians. It's one of the teams they're focusing on. So that's part of things that they are still fighting for. The Black Muslims, this is the Nation of Islam. At the time, that was a violent organization where, again, they wanted separate societies. Integration was not the goal. They wanted their own schools, churches, and support networks. The leaders of the Black Muslims would be Elijah Muhammad and Wallace Fard and Malcolm X. He too will be assassinated by members of the Black Muslim organization. The Black Panthers, they also were part of the nonviolent campaign under MLK, but they kind of were like, hey, that failed. And so we need to take this further. And they were a political party, but also preached revolutionary war. And they had four main desires: equality in education, housing, employment, and civil rights. And the two leaders you would need to know would be Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. Now for the test, for the STAR test, it's important that you will be able to know the individual people, but also the overall purpose of the organizations on these two slides. Moving on to our key vocabulary. I know I keep stressing it. All of these vocabulary terms are fair game, and you could see them on the STAR test. So please, again, review these so that you can have that background knowledge. We're going to highlight just a few that you would be most likely to see on the STAR test. All right, the NAACP and LULAC were both organizations that were also big parts of the civil rights movement. You need to remember the desegregation of the troops. This happened under Harry Truman through executive order. It desegregated both the United States military and ended discriminatory practices in the federal government, and really kind of set the precedent for future civil rights legislation, such as the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which ended both poll taxes, where you had to pay to vote, and literacy tests, tests that proved you could read and write, which were unfairly skewed towards African Americans. Both of these were being used predominantly in southern states to disenfranchise African American voters. We see the Great Society under LBJ. That was his domestic policy. A lot of his success there gets overshadowed by the Vietnam conflict, the cost of that, and his failures there. We talked about Black Panthers. We talked about now Put a Star by Brown v. Board of Education. We really studied that court case, the one that says separate but equal is not okay, overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, and was a huge turning point in the civil rights movement. Slide 5, you continue to see most of these we referred to already in our earlier slides. The Little Rock Nine, you might want to go back and review. Title IX, which promoted gender equality in high school and college education, specifically impacting girls playing sports in both the high school and collegiate level and increasing those numbers. Especially, you need to know the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by President Johnson, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or ethnic origin throughout any place doing business with the federal government. This was a huge moment. The court case Roe v. Wade, be familiar with that. And again, some of the other leaders of the civil rights movement. We covered a lot of them already. Thurgood Marshall would be another one. He was the lawyer in the Brown v. Board of Education, where he won that decision and then becomes the first African-American member of the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, in slide 7, we are going to move on to the end of the Cold War. So I kind of made a note here. The Cold War officially ends in 1991, but there were events throughout the 70s and 80s that were leading up to that. Mikhail Gorbachev, while not a significant figure within the United States history, he was the leader of the USSR that was most significant towards the ending of the Cold War, his policies. All right, so some of the vocabulary associated with the end of the Cold War. If you look right here, we have détente, normalization with China, and Watergate. I just wanted you to know those are all associated with Nixon's presidency. So yes, there was a big scandal, but there was also considerable progress made towards the easing of tensions, specifically with China under Nixon's presidency. The Camp David Accords are significant. This was under President Jimmy Carter, where he negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel after 30 years of tensions. And really, this is seen as, this is Carter's big triumph. Remember, Jimmy Carter is a wonderful person, did not have a lot of success as president, but this is one of his successes. We have the Iran hostage crisis that played out during Carter's presidency, and where 66 Americans were taken hostage in Iran, and Carter refused to negotiate with the terrorists for release. They were not released until the day after Carter left office. And that crisis was part of the big reason why Jimmy Carter was not reelected as president. Ronald Reagan became president after him. Reaganomics was a huge part. Remember, the economy in the 1970s suffered from stagflation. It was very stagnant or still or stuck. And Reagan came in with this sweeping reform program through economics, using supply side to get us out of that stagflation. Some other key things that happened under Ronald Reagan's presidency: he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female Supreme Court justice. That was a significant moment. The Marines that were killed in Lebanon during Reagan's presidency. There was a civil war between Israel and Lebanon, and Israel came to the United States. We're one of their big allies. and asked for support. Our Marines were killed by a suicide bomber, and Reagan withdrew our forces as a result. You have some other terms to look at for Reagan's presidency. Another one of the key things under Reagan was the Iran-Contra affair. I remember this was a huge scandal that did not touch Reagan himself, but a lot of members of his office and were affected by that, where we were on the down low selling arms to Iran in exchange for hostages, and then the money from that sale was then funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua that Congress had withdrawn support for. That was another big deal. The falling of the Berlin Wall was a significant turning point, very close to the end of the Cold War, and just a visible symbol of changes coming. As far as important people during this modern era, end of the Cold War, we talked about Sandra Day O'Connor already, but you can kind of fill things in on this chart as well. She's the first female Supreme Court Justice. This happens under Reagan. Ronald Reagan, Nixon, Goldwater. We talked about Billy Graham, if you remember, was a Christian leader and evangelist during the conservative era of the 1980s. He was a very public figure in the United States. All right, moving on to the late 80s and 90s, we have lots of stars on here. And there's two terms I added that you really should know for the STAR test, and they were left off of this list, but OPEC and Hurricane Katrina. So I'll talk about those here in a moment. The Gulf War was under President George H.W. Bush, where we went into Iraq invaded Kuwait to liberate them from Iraq. Remember that Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwait had been stealing oil when really it was probably more his own motives going in to get oil from Kuwait and take over their oil fields. After that, Saddam Hussein agreed to remove all his troops and to pay Kuwait for damages. And he was supposed to allow UN weapons inspectors in to inspect his country. That's going to be important for another thing later. As far as international organizations, OPEC is the 12 member nations. It's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, where the goal is to stabilize the oil market through supply and demand. GATT turns into the World Trade Organization, which was a free trade organization designed to reduce tariff levels. And this is a huge part of the globalization movement in the modern era. NAFTA began under H.W. Bush and was signed into law under Clinton. It was a trade treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Of course, we know Clinton is impeached, the first president to be so for over 100 years. And then we talked about the election of 2000 and what a complicated election that was between George W. Bush and Gore, that it appeared Gore won, well, he did win the popular vote and appeared on election night that he was going to be the winner. And then everything came down to Florida in this very, very close election where there was recount after recount after recount. And finally, the Supreme Court said that they were to stop. And that is when George W. Bush was declared the winner of Florida, and therefore, through electoral vote, was the winner of the presidency. After George W. Bush is elected president, of course, the biggest event during his presidency is the attacks of September 11th on the United States, which most of y'all are well aware of the details of that. I did want to have a little box there that connects to the War on Terror that follows shortly thereafter. The U.S. Patriot Act is passed, which was controversial because of the civil liberties that it infringed upon, but it expanded the government's ability to wiretap and access, search and seizures and surveillance to try to prevent future terrorist attacks. The election of 2008 is highly significant with the election of Barack Obama as the first African American president. He inherits a very weak economy. The housing bubble had burst in 2008, and the economy was in a huge recession. So he passes the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which slowly but surely gets the economy turned around. The one other event that wasn't on here was Hurricane Katrina. That was under George W. Bush. The significance, of course, is when the levees fail and New Orleans is completely flooded with severe devastation and consequences. All right, slide 11. Significant people from the modern era. We need to add in Sonia Sotomayor, which we talked about during several of our lessons. She's appointed by Barack Obama. She's the first Hispanic female to the U.S. Supreme Court. Of course, Barack Obama is significant, like we just said, as the first African American president. And in his term of office, the Universal Health Care Act, better known as Obamacare. The Clintons, we talked about Bill Clinton, we talked about Hillary Clinton, and that she was the significant as her role after being First Lady, the only First Lady thus far to serve as elected position as a Senator and Secretary of State, and then goes on to run for the office of President herself, and almost won that election. Bill Gates is the founder of Microsoft. You all know Microsoft. That happens in 1976. Highly successful businessman in our country. All right, slides 12 and 13 are 5 Supreme Court cases. I have a big star here because you are most likely going to see these court cases on the STAR test. So you have their descriptions, you have their rulings, and its summary. At the very least, know the summaries, but you need to go back and review Sweat v. Painter, Hernandez v. Texas, Brown versus Board of Education. All of these have to do with civil rights. And then Tinker versus Des Moines is freedom of speech. And then Wisconsin v. Yoder has to do with freedom of religion. And there are good summaries also on slides 14 and 15 of those Supreme Court cases. Slides 16 and 17 are just overviews of all of the wars America has been involved in that we have learned about this year. So there's a couple blanks for us to fill in. Spanish-American War in 1898. Specifically, you need to remember the cause was the sinking of the Maine. Maine and Spain rhyme. Hopefully that helps you out there. Our allies in this war were Cuba. They were the colony of Spain that we were protecting. The opponent was Spain. Remember, this is Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders when we won all of the colonies and kind of emerge as a world power. World War I was also significant, 1914 to 1918. Remember that we entered this war due to unrestricted German submarine warfare, the U-boat attacks, the Zimmermann telegram, and the British naval blockade. The end result of World War I being the Treaty of Versailles, which then it blames Germany and really kind of leads up to some of the causes of World War II. You do need to know Alvin York as the great war hero for the United States, the most decorated war soldier from World War I. World War II is from 1939 to 1941. You need to remember that the United States enters this war on December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then you can remember the allies and the opponents there. Korea and Vietnam, I have these highlighted because these are the proxy wars of the Cold War, the indirect fighting that happened between these two during that time period. You also need to remember the terms containment and domino theory as reasons why the United States was involved in these two wars. For the Vietnam War, make sure that you include that our allies were South Vietnam and our opponents were North Vietnam. And then on the last slide, we have the Bay of Pigs invasion, Persian Gulf War, and then the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. Make sure that you remember that those are both part of the War on Terror that was declared by President George W. Bush. So you can go back and review the overviews of all of those wars on these two slides.